This week's lesson is on apartheid. So first we're going to talk about what happened in South Africa to allow apartheid to happen, and then we're going to talk about what it was and how it ended. So the first one we're going to talk about are what historical events led to apartheid. So 1652 was kind of the beginning, and this is when the Dutch came to settle in South Africa and claimed land as their own. So we've talked about imperialism and colonization before. This is when it hit South Africa. So the Dutch came from Europe and took over southern Africa, claiming it as their own. Again, there were already natives there, as we've studied, but the Dutch took over. In 1806, Great Britain, or England, wanted a piece of the pie. So they came and took over the Dutch, who had taken over about 150 years before. And this actually set off a war, about 100 years of war. They often call it the Boer War, or there's other conflicts that happened within that between the British and the Dutch as far as who would rule South Africa. In 1869, the competition got a little more interesting when they discovered diamonds, and they started mining diamonds. And this is going to make a lot of money, and it's still, today, they mine diamonds in South Africa. But this is kind of when the treatment of the Africans in South Africa was never great. But this is when it progresses to even worse. So they gave Africans, black Africans, the people who were native to there, the worst kind of jobs. And this is when they started really treating them poorly in the workforce. In 1910, the British officially take over, so the Dutch no longer have any claims to South Africa, but the Dutch officially take over and create anti-African laws. Okay, so the treatment of Africans is deteriorating more and more as time goes on. And in 1948, the National Party, led by Afrikaners, who are white people who have settled in South Africa and lived there for probably hundreds of years, they win election and they create apartheid. Okay, so there was discrimination before, but the official policy of apartheid began in 1948. So now you might be asking, well, what exactly is apartheid? Okay, so apartheid was implemented, as we previously stated, began in 1948 and it lasted until 1990. So that's about 52 years of apartheid. The word literally means apartness in Afrikaans, which is the language of most of the people that were in power during apartheid. And it essentially divided South Africa into three racial categories. And your rights and your treatment were based on your race. So here are the three categories. There were whites who had white skin, but were often European descendants or Afrikaans, which means they had Dutch heritage. They've lived in South Africa for generations. These people controlled the farms, the government, education, the military, and even the news. And it was about 17% of the population. Next were the Asians or coloreds. They were going to mix together. And these are anyone that was mixed race. So wasn't purely white or wasn't purely black. It was mixed race, or they were immigrants. There were a decent amount of immigrants that came from India and other Asian countries. And this was about 15% of the population during apartheid. And finally, the worst treated were the blacks. And this was anyone with an African heritage. So in South Africa, there are a variety of different ethnic groups, but Zulu and Xhosa are two of the larger ones. They were treated the worst, and this accounted for 68% of the population. So again, the whites were treated the best under apartheid, and the blacks were treated the worst. So how are people treated during apartheid? This will take up 2 boards. I could probably go on for longer, but I just want to consolidate it into 4 different points. So first of all, it dictated where people lived. So when apartheid was implemented a few years after, they started moving blacks, who remember were the lowest class during apartheid, to homelands. And these homelands or reserves were places that weren't really people's homes, but the whites wanted to move them off of the good land. And so they often had to move hundreds of miles from their homes. They were very great communities of black people in the cities that were middle class and rich black people, but they were all taken from their land and forced to move hundreds of miles away. And that 68% of the population then had to live on 13% of the land. And the land they were given lacked good soil, jobs, and had very few schools. The whites, on the other hand, controlled 87% of the land under apartheid. The second thing that apartheid did was it restricted movement of blacks. So blacks had to carry these passbooks with them, and we read Journey to Joburg, so you've heard about these passbooks, to move outside of their homelands. So if they wanted to go get a job in the city, if they wanted to go visit their family who had a job in the city, if they wanted to do anything outside of where they lived, they had to get someone to sign their passbook to have permission to go there. And if they were caught without it, they could be arrested and jailed. So this is essentially something kind of like a passport, but it's within your own country. And to go outside of your neighborhood. Imagine having to go outside your neighborhood. To go to school, you had to get your passbook signed. To go to the mall, you had to get your passbook signed. To go to Charlotte, you had to get your passbook signed by someone to give you permission. And many people had to leave to work in the city. So they had to get these passbooks signed, and then they had to leave their families to go to work in the city. So a lot of men had to leave their families, and they worked in the city, but had to still live outside the city in these small places called townships, which were essentially just shacks that were outside the city. The next point about how people were treated was it separated the races. So much like segregation in the United States, but much worse. It separated the races. They had different schools, buses, bathrooms, and a whole lot of different things. During apartheid, they actually passed this act here. It's called the Preservation of Separate Amenities Act. And amenities are simply schools, buses, bathrooms, parks. But it established separate but not necessarily equal parks, beaches, post office, public places for whites and blacks. So any public place that was out there was separate. And there were signs for this is the white beach, this is the black beach. Or actually it was more white and non-white because the coloreds could not use the white facilities. So much like you've seen during segregation time, you may have seen pictures of water fountains for blacks or water fountains for whites. The same idea was in South Africa. The difference was that they didn't have to be equal. So black facilities for non-whites could be worse than whites. They didn't have to be equal, as the United States put in a law that they could be separate but had to be equal. And the final thing that apartheid did was to discourage black culture. So all students at one point were now taught in Afrikaans, which is the language of the whites and some of the coloreds. And this was not in their native language. So they were trying to make children basically forget their own language and learn in only the language of the government. They also, at this time, many artists and musicians were exiled during apartheid, so they had to leave the country. Musicians that were making great music, beautiful music, sometimes anti-apartheid music, had to leave the country. And a lot of them moved to the United States, a lot of them moved to Europe, but they could not be in their own country just because they were making music. All right, our next question is, well, how do people protest apartheid? Because probably have seen wasn't very fair, so people aren't just going to sit there and take it. And so a big place for organizing is going to be the townships. And the townships were those shack towns outside the cities where people who worked in the city would live if they weren't back in their homelands. They'd work in the city and then just travel a couple miles outside the townships. But those were a great place for organizing, and a lot of the great ideas came from those townships and meetings that happened there. So civil disobedience and marches were probably the most prominent way to protest. Civil disobedience simply means you're not doing anything violent, but you're breaking the law. So one example was in Sharpeville, where they refused to carry their passbooks that they were required to carry if they moved outside of their homeland. So people refused to carry those. So that's civil disobedience because they broke the law, but in a peaceful way. And also were lots of different marches. So in June 16th, 1976, probably the most famous protest was called the Soweto Uprising. And this was led by students who said, we don't want to learn in Afrikaans, we want to learn in our own language. Sadly, both of these incidents led to, somewhere between 60 and 100 deaths, depending on which one you're looking at. And that was because the police opened fire on the protesters. Sadly, at Sharpeville, a lot of people were shot in the back, which means they were trying to run from the police, and the police gunned them down. There are also organizations like the ANC and the UDF. The ANC is the African National Congress, and the UDF is the United Democratic Front, which brought people together to fight apartheid. So the ANC formed in 1912, back when the ideas for apartheid were probably forming and the injustice was happening against the Africans. But during apartheid, it was banned. They could not exist. It was led by Nelson Mandela before he was put in jail in the 60s. An interesting thing about the ANC is it went underground. So when it was banned, it still existed, but kind of undercover. And the ANC actually started peaceful, but moved to a more violent approach to taking down apartheid. And they even sent people outside the country to train and then come back in to literally fight apartheid. The United Democratic Front was an umbrella organization, meaning a lot of different organizations came under them, and they were dedicated to a peaceful protest. So they brought a lot of people together to peacefully protest apartheid. And then there was the Black Consciousness movement. And this was led by Steve Biko. And this was a movement that fought for black superiority. So just a complete takeover of South Africa. And he encouraged more violent methods. So how did apartheid end? It does not exist today. It ended in 1990. What led to end? And there were three main things that led to the end of apartheid. The first one being the ideology, or just the idea of apartheid, lost popularity among Afrikaners and other people living in South Africa. That no longer could you say whites are superior to blacks. Blacks deserve to be treated terribly. People were not in favor of this idea as much anymore as time went on. There were pressure from other countries, so outside of South Africa, people like the United States, like European countries, put pressure on South Africa and said, we're not going to trade with you if you are still using apartheid. And this is called an embargo. We refuse to trade with you. Banks in other countries aren't going to loan them money, and a lot of countries have to borrow money to be able to pay for things. They refused to loan South Africa any money. And finally, the athletes were banned from any competition. So South Africa couldn't compete in any Olympic Games, in the World Cup. They have a very good rugby team, and that rugby team couldn't compete in international competitions. And finally, there was increased protesting from inside the country. So in the 1980s, this was probably the worst and most violent decade in South Africa. And this led to essentially a police state where the country had police everywhere. There was violent eruptions very often. And so with these three things, finally in 1990, apartheid came to a close. Nelson Mandela wasn't freed until 1991, and he later became president in 1994. We'll talk a little bit in the next few weeks about life since apartheid, but this is the basics of apartheid.